Story 1. Almost every summer I used to go to a campsite, which was a very popular place for kids to go camping during summer breaks. We would stay there for 2 weeks. The campsite was 4 hours away from my home, so I couldn't see my family at all during the whole stay. The camp was located in the middle of the woods, away from villages and cities, so we could have more fun. The campsite we stayed in was in teams, girls and boys, and they were further divided into age groups. A group was for 6-10-year-olds. B group were kids of 11 through 14 years, and C group consisted of kids at 15 through 18. 3 years ago, I went there with my friend Eva to have some fun and adventure. Like every year, they had these huge tents set up close to each other that could easily fit 6 to 8 people in it. The tents had a structure like a teepee, similar to what the Native Americans lived in. They all had a long pole in the middle of the tent that held the tent up. I stayed with Ava and 4 other girls after putting all our stuff inside our respective tents. We had lunch and did several activities. Some went exploring in the woods, and some went canoeing in the nearby river. Me and Ava joined the group who went canoeing. After we returned back, other kids had already started the campfire, so we sat around it and relaxed for a bit. Some kids had brought their guitars and ukuleles. They played their instruments and we sang along. In short, we had a really good time. We then had dinner and went inside our tents not long after. We got our sleeping bags ready and quickly fell asleep as everyone was tired after a long day. In the middle of the night, I woke up as I had to use the restroom. The restrooms were located on the other end of our site where the B group camp was. I was kind of scared because of the dark and of how far it was from our tent. I woke up Ava and asked her to go with me. Turned out she wanted to go too, so we went together. When we were walking, I heard footsteps coming from behind me, but I turned around and nobody was there. I thought it was my imagination because it was night. When we arrived, I quickly used one of the restrooms, and Ava used the one beside me. I took a while to end, so my friend finished first, and she told me she would be heading first as she was thirsty, and the water jars were in the main cabin, so she left. I was okay with it, but then when I finished and was ready to leave, someone was trying to get in the restroom I was in, so I yelled, "I am almost done, wait a bit." But the person kept trying to come inside. I was shocked and startled a bit. I thought Ava was trying to pull a prank on me since we were very close and we would often mess with each other at times. I calmed down and yelled at her, "Stop the prank, it's not funny." But the person didn't stop trying. They kept banging and turning the doorknob. At this point, I froze and didn't know what to do. For some reason, it got a little creepy, and my heartbeat got louder, as it felt very unusual for someone to do this. After lots of banging, I saw a hand reaching from under the door, and it didn't look like the hand of some teenager. Rather, it was wrinkly and dirty, like that of a middle-aged man it was trying really hard to reach for. And eventually it grabbed hold of my leg. I screamed and stopped my foot on his hand. He groaned in pain as I took the chance and slammed open the door really hard, so the person who was trying to get in got hit, and I ran out straight towards where the camp guides were staying in. At some point I turned back and saw a tall man chasing me with a wooden block in his hand. As I reached the cabin, I banged on the door frantically. I looked back once again, but he was gone. I was shaking uncontrollably, and they made me sit down and gave me water. I told them everything that happened, and one of the instructors called the police immediately. That night, everyone slept in the main cabin with all the instructors to ensure everyone's safety. I slept well because of how tired I was without thinking about what happened. The next morning, the police arrived and searched the area. After searching for hours, they found the man who was hiding in the woods and arrested him. It turned out he was a psychopath convict who escaped prison just a week ago. After what happened, I went back home and tried to find who he was. I found out that he had killed his wife and tried to murder his 15-year-old daughter as well, but she escaped and got him put in prison. Since this incident, I haven't been to a campsite as I was traumatized by the experience. Story 2. This incident happened to me when I was 16. Me and my friend Mike loved to go on camping trips with our parents. But this time it was different as both our parents were busy and could not take us for a trip, but they allowed us to go alone for the first time and the last. His parents dropped us at the usual place we used to go on most of our trips. We started searching for a nice spot to set up our camp. After walking for a while, we found a spot and quickly set up our tents, built a fire and sat around it, took out some snacks and chatted while roasting marshmallows, and soon the sun went down. As it got dark, we started scaring each other by telling each other scary stories. We laughed and joked about ghosts and monsters. Then suddenly I thought I heard heavy breathing coming from behind the woods. It was a rather quiet night and I could hear it clearly. I asked Mike, but he didn't hear it. He thought I was messing with him, trying to scare him. I shoved it off and went back to roasting my marshmallows. The night closed in, and at around 10 p.m., we went inside our tents to get some rest and soon fell asleep. The next morning, we went on a hike over to a nearby lake, and as we were hiking, I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. I looked around, but I couldn't anything out of the ordinary. I told Mike this, but he didn't think anything of it. He didn't take me seriously and just laughed. When we reached the lake, we swam around in the water for a while. As we were swimming, I noticed someone standing behind a tree on the other side of the lake. It seemed like a figure of a man. I thought I saw him peek out at me for a moment. I was kind of freaked out by that, but Mike still did not take me seriously. I convinced him to investigate the tree, but when we looked behind it, there was nothing there. While we were walking back, I heard a rustle in the bushes. I asked Mike if he heard it, and he nodded. We turned around and again saw nothing. Mike thought it was just a wild animal and kept walking. I heard a stick crack from the same direction. I looked over and caught sight of the figure again. He was peeking at me from behind the bush. He was looking at me directly with his wide, bloodshot eyes. I screamed and he disappeared into the woods. Mike looked back at me, but since he didn't see anyone, he figured I was trying to trick him. Mike was pissed. He yelled at me and said that I was ruining his trip. We didn't talk to each other for the whole day. When we reached our camp, Mike started the fire and I decided to take a walk into the woods that night. As I was walking, I heard a gruff voice from behind me. Thinking it was Mike, I shouted angrily, "Hey, what are doing?" I turned around, and the person I saw was not Mike. That person wore a ragged jacket and pair of stain-torn jeans and had a dirty baseball cap on his head. He had gray hair and the same bloodshot eyes. He hurried off into the thorn bushes the moment I saw him. I was wearing shorts and didn't want to cut my legs, so I didn't chase him. I returned to the camp and saw Mike sitting by the fire. He immediately apologized to me. I didn't tell Mike about what I had seen as I didn't want to start another fight. We eventually went inside our tents. The night was going fine until I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise coming from outside. It sounded like someone walking around. I checked my phone and saw it was 4 a.m. I also heard some gruff breathing like I had heard before, and that's when I realized we hadn't put out our campfire. However, I was too nervous to go outside because of the strange noises. I then saw the shadow of a man walk by the side of our tent. It looked like he was wearing a baseball cap and a jacket. What happened next, I will never forget. He pulled out what looked like a knife, and slowly I heard the zipper begin to open. My heart started beating faster and faster. A head poked into the tent with terrible bloodshot eyes. He smiled a wide, creepy smile with yellow teeth showing, and he whispered to me in a raspy voice, "I killed your friend and you'll be next." I was frozen in fear and my whole body went numb and my mind went blank and I didn't know what to do. My body didn't even move an inch, nor did a word come out of my mouth. I just stared at him as my breathing got heavier, just as he raised his knife over me. Mike came and punched him in the side, right where his kidney was. Mike was a pretty big guy, so he was able to knock him down. The next thing I knew, I heard him punching the man from outside. I was still frozen in fear and didn't leave the tent. After a while, I heard police sirens coming. Mike had dialed 911 before heading over to my tent. Soon after, the officers nabbed him and told us everything was okay, and they called our parents. Meanwhile, we sat still in fear and shock as we watched them take him away. When he was handcuffed and put inside the car, he turned and looked at us and gave a creepy smile. Soon, our parents came and picked us up. Mike was a bit injured and was taken to the hospital immediately after that, and I went back home. I still wonder what would have happened to me if Mike hadn't been there. Story 3. This is the story of when me and my boyfriend went on a hike. I usually went on a solo hike, and one day I decided to go on a small hiking trip during my college break. But this time my boyfriend insisted on joining me for this trip. It was the autumn season in early October. We packed the stuff necessary for hikes and set off. We also took his dog Max, who is a German Shepherd, along with us. And after an hour's drive, we reached our destination, parked our car at the entrance of the hiking trail, got our gear, and started our hike. There were a few people hiking other than us, and after walking for about 30 minutes, we got to a point that was much more isolated. As we were walking, I suddenly stopped, and my boyfriend looked at me and asked what was wrong. I told him that I was feeling overwhelmed and eerie, as if someone was watching us. He told me maybe it was because of the weather. It was gloomy as the skies looked darker than usual that day. We continued our walk, and after a while, I looked behind us as I heard leaves crunching as if someone was walking over them. And sure enough, a guy who looked to be in his 30s was coming out of the woods and was slowly creeping up towards us. It was unusual as he wasn't walking on the trail. There was no one around, so for this guy to magically appear out of nowhere from deep in the woods was kind of creepy. He had a strange look on his face and a chilling smile. Max saw him coming towards us and started barking. My boyfriend tightened his leash, but the man got startled. He stopped smiling and had a nervous look on his face. He stopped walking towards us and crept back into the woods. As my boyfriend was trying to calm Max down, I kept my eye on that guy while he was walking away. He turned and gave me a creepy wide smile that sent chills down my spine. I realized that if he was a fellow hiker, why was he not walking along the trail? I whispered to my boyfriend and told him that this guy looked sketchy. My boyfriend saw that I was scared, so he handed Max's leash to me and told me to go ahead as he walked behind me. After hiking for an hour, we found a good spot to stop and relax before continuing our trail. I was unpacking our food while my boyfriend went to pick up some dry wood to start a fire. While I was taking the food out, I heard Max growling at something. I thought he had seen a rabbit or a bird. But then his growls turned into barks, and that's when I turned around to see what he was barking at, and saw the same man from earlier, and gasped. I got goosebumps and was now confirmed that this guy was surely stalking us. I screamed for my boyfriend, and he came running towards where I was. As soon as he came, the man disappeared into the woods, and I told my boyfriend everything I saw. He had enough and got out his pocket knife and walked towards the tree where I saw him. He looked around but saw no one. At this point, I was scared enough to leave this place as soon as possible. My boyfriend agreed. We ate our food before leaving and went back the same way we came from. Soon it got dark. We were halfway through the trail. My boyfriend was a bit ahead of me, and I was walking a little slower as my legs were starting to hurt. I stopped for a while, and this is when I heard bushes rustling from the left side. I didn't call my boyfriend and looked around the way from where I heard the sound. As I turned, that same man from earlier jumped out and grabbed me. I was struggling, but he was way stronger. He covered my mouth and I wasn't able to scream. Tears fell down from eyes and didn't know how to free myself from his clutch. I just wiggled around, but it was of no use since my arms were pulled backward. I tried so hard to scream, but no matter what I did, he overpowered me. Soon I began to lose consciousness as my airways were blocked. Max probably sensed something was wrong as he turned around. He pulled my boyfriend and the leash slipped from his hand and he sprinted towards me and started ripping off his leg. He released me and started groaning in pain. I fell to the ground and started gasping for air. My boyfriend ran after Max and tackled the man. He is a fairly built man who hits the gym regularly. He pinned him down and started punching him in the face till he lost consciousness. We called the police and waited there. It took 20 minutes or so for them to arrive. And this whole time the man was blacked out. The police arrived and apprehended him. They told us that this man was a wanted sex offender and a murderer who had been on the loose for several days. He had already killed 2 of his victims who were almost the same age as me. I didn't know what would I have done if my boyfriend and Max had not been there with me that day. After this incident, I got too scared to go on hikes alone. Me and my boyfriend got married, and we still go on hiking trips together. Story 4. This happened to me and a friend of mine We were 23 back then, and we often spent our weekends hiking, camping, or fishing in the woods. On one such day, we decided to go on a 2-night camping trip to the Adirondack Mountains of New York. We are both very comfortable with nature and love a getaway from our busy schedule once in a while. Upon reaching our destination, we parked the car near the entrance of the camping area. We hiked for about 5 miles to get to a small lake and set up our camp. We didn't expect to run into anyone else. As it got dark, we started a fire and sat around it. We saw a flashlight moving around on the other side of the lake around 10:30 p.m. This was fairly unusual, however. We did not think much of it, but as time went on, the flashlight moving around the lake kept moving closer to our campsite. We kept discussing who could possibly be wandering around the woods in the middle of the night. We did not want to deal with any unwelcomed guests. Once it was clear that the person or people were heading for our campsite, we got up and moved off into the nearby woods to see who it was. I took a small axe with me and my friend had a riffle. We weren't expecting any trouble, and we certainly didn't want to make any either. Now, for the moment of truth, the flashlight came near the light of our fire, and there was a man. He had a beard with ragged clothes and looked like he was in his 40s. He wandered around a bit and then went inside our tent. He started rummaging through our belongings and took out my friend's bag. He then yelled, "I know you are out there, come out now." We tried to stay quiet and were very careful to not step on twigs and fallen leaves. He had what looked to be a shotgun. By now we figured he wasn't friendly. He lingered around with his flashlight still on, probably trying to search for us. He then pointed his flashlight towards the woods where we were hiding, but luckily he didn't see us. He then shouted again, "I will count to 3. If you don't come out, you will have to face the consequences." We knew better than to come out. We just waited there and peeped carefully through the overgrown bushes. 1, he shouted as he picked up my friend's backpack. At this point, I got a bit concerned but also curious about what he was going to do next. My heart was pounding very fast. 2, he shouted again and threw his backpack in the fire. Me and my friend looked at each other with horrified expressions. I knew we were both thinking the same thing. This man was not sane. As he counted to 3, he pointed his gun in our direction and open-fired. It barely missed us as we hid behind thick trees. Sweat started dripping from my forehead, and my heart was beating so fast. My friend whispered to me, "Should I fire at him?" I told him not to. We waited a few minutes and then he started to leave. We still kept hidden until he was no longer in sight. As soon as his flashlight disappeared completely, we came out, packed everything we could fit in my bag, leaving the tent as it was, not caring what time it was. We rushed back to my car. We went straight to the ranger's office and told them everything. By the time we reached there, it was already 2 a.m. They took our statements and told us they would contact us if they found anything. We went back to my apartment and never went to that place again. We didn't get any updates on that guy as well. We still don't know if he was caught or if he's still out there. Out. Story 5. This is a creepy story of what I experienced while camping with a friend of mine 5 years ago. We went camping in a deep valley, almost unknown, and we drove for more than 10 hours and walked for an hour to get there. Then a majestic scenery of nature unfolded in front of us, and clear water, mountains, and fresh air surrounded us. This was a paradise. We got our fishing gear and set them up. Meanwhile, I heard a strange sound. At first I thought it was a bird or a small animal, but the more I listened, the more it sounded like a person's voice. I asked Ben if someone else came here, but he replied that this was a place he only knew. I looked around, and to my surprise, I found a man in the grass staring at us, wearing something very shabby like leather. He was looking at us with a blank stare, and it seemed that he was holding something like raw meat of some animal in his hand. I was startled and shouted, asking who he was, but he didn't say anything, and continued making insect-like noises. We got goosebumps and turned on our cell phones and got ready to call the police. Then he disappeared into the forest, anxious. We wondered whether we should stop camping, but we couldn't go home since we barely got here. We were walking in that area, exploring new things. That's when I saw a girl eating some wild berries. She looked to be around 10 or 11 years old. It was very odd to see a little girl in the midst of an isolated forest. I thought we had a ghost. But when Ben called out to her, she turned her head in our direction, and as soon as she saw us, she fled from there. Maybe it was the daughter of the man we saw earlier. At least now we knew we weren't alone here. It was a weird day, but as time passed, we forgot about it. When we came back, we saw some of our belongings were shattered in front of our tents. We figured it was the deed of the man we had seen earlier, but shook it off thinking he was a mentally disabled man. None of our stuff was stolen, so we didn't really bother to find and confront him. As it got dark, we lit the campfire, ate the fishes we had caught and called it a night. We went inside our tents and fell asleep. I woke up to the sound of high-pitched screaming and realized that Ben was howling. I hurried to his tent and saw that the man we encountered during the day and several other people were grabbing Ben's arms and legs, pulling him frantically. It was as if they were trying to tear Ben's limbs apart, and they pulled with all their strength. My whole body began to shake as I watched this horrific scene. I could feel my fingers turning cold. I screamed and told them to stop, but they kept pulling. By the look of it, they seemed to be a family. I shouted again, and one of them stopped and looked straight at me. I said, "I have a cell phone and I am calling the cops." He got up and sprinted towards me. I panicked and ran away from there as Ben's screams echoed through the forest. I ran as fast as I could as tears started rolling down my eyes. I felt bad for leaving him behind, but I knew I couldn't do anything against those 4 people. I was barefoot but didn't care about the stones and pebbles that were tearing my feet. After running for a while, I turned around, but he was no longer chasing. Maybe he lost sight or he decided to quit. Either way, I was a little relieved. I hid in the bushes and dialed 911. My hands and legs were still shaking, and I could not feel my feet, and my heart was beating really fast from the running. I was gasping for air when they picked up. I tried to tell them what happened, but my voice was barely coming out. I gasped, and my breathing got heavier. As I started sobbing like a child, the dispatcher said it was going to be okay and told me to stay where I was. I crouched and waited for them to arrive. As I waited, I kept thinking about Ben. I didn't know what had happened to him and just hoped for him to be all right. After a while, sirens were heard and the police arrived. They went inside the tent and saw Ben lying there. Luckily, he was alive but had severe injuries and a broken leg. They then searched the area but couldn't find them. Ben was rushed to the hospital immediately. Days later, the police contacted me and told me that the culprits had been caught. They were a family that lived in the mountains, and it turned out that they had been grazing grass and eating raw animals in the mountains, completely distant from civilization. They live in valleys and cliffs, so their grip became unusually strong. They couldn't speak any language, so it was hard to communicate. After hours of interrogation, the police concluded that they were probably scared and thought of us as a threat, so they attacked us first before we could harm them. They were living in the wilderness and didn't know what or what not was life-threatening to them. What happened to Ben was very tragic and unfortunate. I moved states after that incident and never went camping again. I still go to therapy as after the incident I got PTSD. The end. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.